Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Educator Experience podcast. My name is Salli Carter, and this is a space where I sit down with educators from around the world to talk about impactful moments in their teaching careers. In this episode, I sit down with Gillian Thomas Martin for a reflective and important conversation about what it means to be a non-Indigenous educator working toward decolonization in Canada. With nearly 15 years of experience in corporate learning and development and a deep personal commitment to truth and reconciliation, Gillian shares how colonial systems continue to shape education, workplace learning, and institutional structures in ways that often feel invisible and even normalized. She speaks openly about unpacking her own identity, responsibility, and relationship to this work, and how that journey has reshaped her approach to facilitation, leadership, and learning. Together today, we explore the emotional complexity that many non-Indigenous educators experience, including discomfort, uncertainty, and fear of saying the wrong thing, and why leaning into that discomfort is really essential for meaningful change. We also discuss what genuine allyship can look like beyond performative gestures, emphasizing relationship building, humility, trust, and long-term commitment. This truly honest and nuanced conversation highlights the powerful role that us educators and facilitators play in disrupting colonial patterns and creating more humane, reflective, and decolonizing spaces across higher education, K-12, and professional development spaces everywhere. So thank you so much, everyone, for all of the support. And I think you will really resonate and take something from this incredibly genuine conversation. Let's get to it with Gillian Thomas Martin.
Being an educator is one heck of a lonely journey, but every step holds a story, an experience that shapes how we teach, learn, and grow. Welcome to the Educator Experience. I'm your host, Salli Carter, and together we'll explore the moments that define us as educators. Through authentic conversations and shared experiences, we're building a community that connects, reflects, and inspires, all while breaking down barriers in education, one story at a time. You are not alone. Let's grow together.
Well, Gillian, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. I would love to start by just learning or hearing a little bit about you and your journey into education and where you're at now.
I work in corporate learning and development. I work within the BC Public Service, so provincial government service employees, public service employees, I should say. And need to be clear, all my comments today are like my personal perspectives. I share that not to say that I'm representing my employer in any way. I come into this work, the one thing I find interesting about like corporate learning as an industry is like we all have our own entry points. So we work as educators, we care about learners, but like every single one of us got into this is helping our colleagues and other employees learn through different ways. For me, I was working in a manufacturing organization, say 15 years ago, but I'm scared to admit it's been that long, more than that.
A couple of years ago.
Couple years ago. And it was, stepping into that sort of team lead role where I was teaching new staff on how to do the processes and working to help keep the process documentation up to date. That led into that organization created a position called a training coordinator, trying to like formalize some of that on the job training processes and stuff like that. And I fell in love with that aspect so much more than actually like hands-on out on the manufacturing floor doing the work, the like thinking through how to help other people learn and like building out a train the trainer program and building out the various training courses for the safety programs that we ran and things like that led me into the institute. At the time, it was called the Canadian Society for Training and Development, which is now the Institute for Performance and Learning, which focuses on professional development. They have a series of competencies and you can achieve certification through them, which I did because I don't hold a degree in anything. I'm looking at how do I make a career out of teaching people how to do their jobs without having to do the job myself, so to speak.
This is interesting. Yeah, that it's core competencies. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I achieved certification 2018. I'm a certified training and development professional. Have, grown within various organizations, really leaning into it. Love the instructional design aspect to it. So
Mm,
it's like, here's the thing we want our employees to do and they're not doing it. Why? First, figuring out, can learning help? Or
mm.
is it like some environmental, cultural, like workplace culture thing where learning can't help? And then if learning does help, like what are the helpful practice activities? And how do we measure whether that's been effective or not? Figuring out how to scaffold the right amount of information and the right sort of practice activities with the right type of feedback from the right type of subject matter experts. I love that part of it.
It's literally post-secondary, but in corporate. Like, it's the same lingo, it's the same idea, the
Totally.
same concept. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I've worked with colleagues who have come over from academia and like bringing in a lot of those really good skill sets. And the one thing that I would say is can be tricky for folks navigating between the two work environments is the in corporate, if you can't tie it to those measurable business priorities and outcomes, learning is not the reason we're in business.
Right. Right.
So your learning program, you need to be able to tie it to the reason we're in business. Or I've seen it the other way where like folks come over and they're like, oh, all of a sudden things make so much more sense to them. And they just lean right into that. And it keeps the learning really lean. It keeps it like that just in time, just enough in the flow of work type of solutions to really help folks improve their performance at work or adopt the new system that we're implementing. Sometimes it's projects like our managers need to learn how to have difficult conversations with employees. And how do you have like all of these like communications foundations and all that soft skill stuff?
No fighting, no fist fights at work, folks. Thanks.
Right. Right. We sometimes joke that like half of the reason why workplace like performance and learning professionals exist is the whole like, don't be a jerk at work.
Sign outside one of my offices. Yes. It's
Like
funny to say.
sometimes if you are a jerk at work, here's the processes. If someone's being a jerk to you, here's the processes you follow. If you supervise people who are being a jerk, here's the processes you follow. If you think your supervisor is the jerk, here's the process. Like it's,
God, this is perfect.
uh,
I am literally gonna write this outside my office and take a picture for this podcast. It's gonna be the "Don't be a jerk at
don't
work"
be a jerk
podcast.
at work. Like
Yeah.
I swear, having been in this industry as long as I have, that's like half of what it is every
Um,
organization. But it's
yes.
people are different. And so how we understand what's being a jerk versus not, like how do you measure that? What can we hold employees accountable to? What can we hold managers accountable to? How do we build those soft skills, EQI, and keep it within the bounds of labor regulations and labor laws appropriate for your jurisdiction, like all that type of stuff.
So in your just a few years of experience, just a couple, um, is there something that stands out as a memorable, impactful moment in your journey thus far?
Absolutely. So situate for your audience within British Columbia, where I live and work, we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And with that, there is an action plan, a 5-year action plan that's in play. And I am on a project that directly supports one of those action items around essential training for all BC Public Service employees. It has been impactful for me in so many ways because it has challenged everything I assume to be true about the world. And it's so much bigger than just everything I assume to be true about how I do my job, but that has definitely come into it. um, Everything I assume to know about how learning and development within the workplace happens. Um, and so some of the impacts with that is like recognizing and learning more about my family and my position and my relationship to colonialism within BC and Canada. I am a descendant of settlers from Europe. My family on my mom's side came to Canada in 1876 as Ukrainian Mennonite farmers from Eastern Europe area at the time. And they settled in what is now Treaty 4 territory. I still have relatives that live there on those original farms that they settled. And so recognizing that, I have benefited directly from how those treaties and the Canadian government displaced the First Nations to create farms and agriculture land for settlers. My dad's side of the family, I don't know as much. I know it's been at least 4 generations. I know for sure my great-grandpa came to Canada. I know that there is British ancestry in there, but I don't know the details as specifically to that. And so that's one of the pieces that it's like, what is my relationship with colonialism in Canada? And how has it impacted me? So that's been one of the learning with it. And it's like, I also live and work on the unceded territories of the Quetzin peoples. Modern descendants of those include Cowichan tribes, Penelakut tribe, Chemainus, Wyaxin First Nation, and the Halalt First Nation. And so thinking about like, what is my relationship to the lands where I am living today and to those peoples? And that's sort of where I'm currently looking in some of the personal reconciliation work that I'm doing is trying to learn more about that, like location specific. When I do a land acknowledgement and I acknowledge the territories of the Quetzin peoples, what does that really mean? And then this ties in with like some of the unpacking of like how I do my work. Like I believe that as non-Indigenous educators, whether you're in education like you or like corporate learning like me, like we have responsibilities within truth and reconciliation and to review our content and our curriculum with the lenses of those Indigenous peoples whose ways of knowing and being I'm on their lands. So like, and I don't have answers. So I also want to be exceptionally clear that like any mistakes or misunderstandings as I'm chatting about this are mine and should not reflect like any of the Indigenous peoples I've been learning from along the way, any of my Indigenous colleagues that I've been working with who've been so impactful in my learning. As I start like unpacking what that means for how I do my work through this sort of impactful learning moment in my career, is this applies so much more broadly than building a course on truth and reconciliation. Honestly, like that's how I came into this project. All right, we're going to build a course on this essential learning about these totally, right? These essential components that apply to BC public service employees. Okay, well, we've got this legislation that we're accountable to, that we play a role in how the government meets its mandate in all legislation. And so, what does this piece of legislation mean? Okay, great. How naive I was 3 years ago when we started that project. And so it's that this is a learning in progress. And I've come to just accept this as that when they talk about those lifelong learning moments, like, yes, this has been an impactful, pivotal component for me. And I've just scratched the surface. I know that I will never be done with this.
So I have some questions. So how are you learning what to take back? Are you learning from First Nations groups themselves who are training you, or where's that coming from?
Yes to all of the above. So our work, that project specifically, the way that the language is in the legislation as well as in the action plan is that it is done in consultation and cooperation in a distinctions-based approach. So without getting into too much of the specifics, we are working directly with First Nations political organizations, Métis political organizations, and to co-develop. That's part of the complexity I have had to learn to navigate is typical corporate learning and development. It's like you have your clear sign-off authority is like the business owner who's going to say, yep, this is good, and here. And it's like the governance over this project is significantly more complex. If I receive the feedback on the content we've developed from those as it comes in from the various partners, and then it's my job to really, as part of the content development, to sort of synthesize that and find. So it's like when you have lots of feedback along the way, that shifting worldview of trying to really understand and unpack that. So yes, they haven't been in specific teacher roles in any way, shape, or form, but I have taken the personal responsibility to then dive deeper. I have some colleagues, I mentioned others on the project team who are responsible for those relationships with those various political organizations to ensure that we're co-developing in a good way with First Nations, Métis, Inuit. They have helped me along the way. And I took responsibility for my own learnings. I have trust with some individual Indigenous people who have helped me along the way, who've been able to help me learn how to assess whether or not something is a credible resource that can help me with learning along the way. Because that's the other key skill. Like, so many folks, any sort of equity deserving learning that you want to do, like if you want to talk gender identity, if you want to talk about how we build more inclusivity in our learning, and with reconciliation, how we look at that as ensuring that the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected and upheld, and that the truth is told as part of that. You see it in the online chatter all the time of activists and stuff like that, of like, use Google, the information's all out there. I strongly believe that, you know, the algorithms built into our search engines don't help if you tell people to just go off and learn. So I think that there's a key skill in there, and learning how to assess whether it's a credible resource to help in your learning along the way. 2, foundational early learning resources I had that really helped me start unpacking all of it. And they're connected in the aha moments I had. The Office of the Provincial Health Officer did a project a few years back on unlearning and undoing white supremacy. And they have a webinar that they did that's recorded, that is up and available. It's publicly available on that, where doctors Kate Youngblood and Danielle Bain-Smith talk about the project, the metaphors they used in their work, what they learned along the way. And it was about, like, within their own organization, some of the learning that they have leaned into as part of that project of unlearning and undoing white supremacy. And that recorded webinar was like a game changer for me. My executive director sent it to me, just the link of it. And she used in there, "I see you as a copper pot." And I'm like,
What's
okay, what does this mean?
Like, gotta dig deeper here. Yes.
Exactly. So,
Yeah,
of course, like when your executive director sends you a link, you take the ownership to like lean in and learn more, right? One of the metaphors they use is on defining the different types of work for settlers, allies, non-Indigenous people, and for Indigenous people in truth and reconciliation. And so they use the metaphor as the copper pot or the woven basket. And so the woven basket represents the bundle of work that is for Indigenous peoples to lead for themselves through healing from colonialism and through reconciliation efforts and things like that. The copper pot represents that of allies and non-Indigenous people in this work. And one of the first things in there is that building trust with Indigenous peoples to dismantle the systems that non-Indigenous peoples have set up and created, including our education systems, in order to undo white supremacy. Now, we can't just go in and like overhaul everything, because that can be super damaging too and create more harm. So that's where it's partnership, and there needs to be that trust that we can do that copper pot bundle of work in a good way. So I come back to those quite often, that webinar of like, am I in my lane? I am a non-Indigenous person who cares deeply about this, is deep in the learning about how does this change my practices? How can I adjust everything I talked about at the front, like how we build a course in communication, how we look at learning for when we're implementing a new system or technology in the organization, all of that type of stuff. That's within my bundle of work as an educator. And how is that influenced by the bundle of work of building trust with Indigenous peoples, recognizing the impacts of colonialism, and what systems might I be maintaining or upholding that are causing harm that I can learn to see more clearly to start looking at how can we dismantle this in such a way that it is still centering the safety for the Indigenous peoples, our Indigenous, in my context for the workplace, it's like my Indigenous colleagues and employees. So that was one of the key foundational learning resources. The other one is a textbook, and I actually have a copy of it, so I can show it on camera. Wayi, Indigenous Pedagogies, An Act for Reconciliation and Anti-Racism Education by Joe Crona. This, I read it a little over a year ago, and it's just mind-blowing.
I'm so excited. Like, as soon as we're done, I'm just gonna buy it.
I can send you links.
Perfect. And we'll add them in the show notes too. So everybody has access to these resources too. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
This textbook, while there's so much good in it, it does focus on like K through 12 education. And the experience of the author is very much the BC education system. So she's been part of the First Nations Education Steering Committee. And it looks at like, how do we evaluate our K through 12 curriculum was her experience, but you can extrapolate from that for other education systems to consider Indigenous perspectives while also unpacking that it's not a pan-Indigenous approach. Not all Indigenous people are the same. All of the language in the Declaration Act and the Action Plan also considers a distinctions-based approach. What does that mean? First Nations are distinct from Métis, are distinct from Inuit. And if I go back to like my own family history, the First Nations who are displaced in Treaty 4 territory and the distinctions of what it means to be on Treaty 4 territory is different from myself on unceded Quw'utsun people's territory. And those prairie nations, I know that their ways of knowing and being, their pedagogies might be different from Quw'utsun people's, which is where I live now. And so how does that change things? Like, you can't take this pan-Indigenous approach.
You've been going through an entire transformational learning experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the questions I sort of challenged my colleagues with a while ago, we, as part of, this was a few years back, we did a tour of the legislature as a workplace activity. So much of our work within BC Public Service is tied. So it's like linking that big picture of why we're here, what we do. And within BC's legislature, they have these stained glass windows with these different like markers of civilization. And I used those air quotes. So then I started peeling back, and like in a later conversation with my colleagues at work about it, I'm like, what does saying like written language as a marker of civilization do to devalue civilizations with oral histories? It is not a neutral statement. It's that what gets valued in knowledge systems and how we think and that way of knowing and being is not neutral. And like, I gotta say, Joe Crona's book, she has no idea who I am. This is not at all any sort of like, but she unpacks in the book a phrase she calls epistemic racism. So epistemic is that like of or relating to knowledge, the ways of knowing and being, and that racism is the valuing and devaluing of knowledge systems of specific cultures. So that, you know, we go, oh, writing was the advance of civilization. And it's like,
Was it?
Was it? That's actually a really harmful statement to say. And so how does that influence how we teach about history? Those Eurocentric ways of knowing and being that are so insidious.
So I have a question. This goes back to you developing content and metrics for your employer. You have a new experience. How are you measuring that translation into your workplace? And is it possible?
I don't know if it's possible.
Are we trying to put a round peg, square hole kind of thing?
I don't know how much it's I mean, I'm trying. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. I'm trying. And I'm trying through a few different methods. One is, thank goodness for supportive leadership. Within my own team, I know I have strong support from my leadership to like share back as much as I'm learning through this experience, and to have some of those tricky, challenging conversations with colleagues. I am more of an introvert. So something like this, where I'm like going forward and presenting on things, I'm like, I don't know. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I want to be more behind the scenes. And I'm trying to be more intentional about what things I put forward as recommendations. And that ties into today is the first day of my new program where it's like I'm specifically furthering my education. Now, it's weird because I do recognize that education through a formal academic setting is totally a colonial thing to get that colonial recognition from my employer, that I can like lean and advocate towards this. Continuing to build trust with my Indigenous colleagues that it's not learning about, it's learning from, and how do I stay in my lane as a non-Indigenous person, advocating for change, making sure I'm not speaking over them. So it's building those coalitions and continuing to lean into that network, listening. Where do I have the space to step in and lead as a non-Indigenous person? And where is it my place to step back and listen? And I do not always get that correct. Like I share, it's easy to say the thing than it is to do the thing. It's far easier to say it. So I answer that in these are some of the things I hope I'm doing.
It's a pattern. We are unlearning lifelong behaviors, lifelong beliefs. We're unpacking while simultaneously trying to decolonize our classroom and our training materials and our space, while we are also unlearning. Perfection is not an option, I don't think. I think,
No.
yeah.
No.
That doesn't
Particularly not this early in the stage. And so like, what are
Right.
those metrics? Like, I don't have metrics. We're not measuring anything. Right now, I don't have formal measurements. I know I have sidebar conversations with some trusted Indigenous colleagues where it's like, that didn't feel good.
Mm.
Now, whether that's something systemic doesn't feel good that we're both recognizing, or whether it's she's calling me in when I've done something, and like I've built that trust where she knows she can call me in. For one friend in particular, one colleague that I'm thinking of, and I'm open to that feedback of like, that didn't feel good. Really sitting with that and learning how to sit with that feedback and do my own self-reflection. If they send me something, they know I'm going to read it. I'm going to pay attention. If they send me a link to a podcast, an article, or something, they know I'm going to pay attention. And they know they can have the follow-up difficult conversation with me of like, that didn't sit right. Because it's that entire worldview. And I've sort of curated some questions for myself to help me, like, how am I doing? How am I measuring how I'm doing in this? Am I on the right track? Am I in my lane? Am I making progress towards that? Or am I going too far out of bounds? To sort of like keep myself going. That self-reflection.
It's really interesting because even it feels like a complete colonial question I asked. Even like, how are you measuring your indigenization efforts in your training? Like, oh my gosh.
I do it all the time.
Oh my God.
And it's also recognizing those moments where it's like, yes, this is progress. Just last week, I had a team meeting. We're all non-Indigenous within my team, specifically unrelated to that project, where we were talking about like evaluation of courses and how we evaluate courses, how we evaluate learners, whether they've, successfully learned. And in the corporate environment, we don't like doing tests. We don't have like observations. We don't ask people to submit these written assignments. Papers are not a thing we deal with.
APA only, please, folks. We're like, what?
Right? I know. The fact that I've had a few emails recently for APA only. This is going to be a new learning experience for me as well, going back to
Welcome.
school.
Yeah.
But one of my colleagues, who is one of those folks who I've had a lot of one-on-one conversations with, she is also not Indigenous like myself. I can have a lot of those good, really challenging conversations. She's curious to learn more, to learn from me, to learn from others. She was talking about course evaluation and measurements and all of that. And she's like, yeah, here's what we got from this one consultant firm that we were working with, there's ways to do that. And she's like, so I think for this initiative, like, these are what our options are. She's like, and I say all of this knowing all of this is incredibly deeply colonial as well. And so there's questions on that. And that to me was just like a personal win, so to speak, because I'm like, I'm not the only one seeing this. So it goes back to that first, like, can you start seeing where what is your relationship with colonialism in the work you do? How has colonialism shaped how you think about the standards for your industry? For me, that's a win, because I'm like, I've got one other colleague who's starting to call it out,
Yeah. And
and like
question,
openly in front of a
yeah.
team, and question. It's
Yeah.
like, are we going to change what our evaluation process is for that project and that program? Probably not. But it's
The
been
conversations are
recognized.
starting. Yes, 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 yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Incredible. Wow, what an incredible how long has this project been? When did this transformational experience start?
I've been on this project for about 3 years, and
3
it's
years.
been
Wow.
such a privilege. It's been some of the most challenging work of my career, because it has challenged everything like I said before, everything I think to know to be true about myself and life and how I do my job and what my industry is all about, and all of that. It has been so challenging to have to like face all of that and think it and navigate through, to be able to like sit on this side of the conversation, be like, here's what I've learned along the way. It has not been as easy. There's been self-reflection. There's been days of I just sit there like journaling out some hard feelings. I call them my complicated white person feelings, because it's like I am facing the reality of myself as a settler in a settler colonial state, and everything I know to be true rests on that. And how does it shift when you start seeing that, and you start seeing the injustices that has led to, and the harm that has led to and created, and recognizing your responsibilities within that, and where you have the ability to advocate for change, to make change. There's big pieces of it that I would love to change in our society that I can tell you I have like zero control over. But in the work that I do have some scope of control. And so what is that within my scope of responsibility to start dismantling and advocate and push for that in a good way, while still also recognizing that woven basket bundle of work to ensure I'm not doing harm to Indigenous peoples, to ensure I'm respecting their leadership in this space, I'm respecting their knowledge in this space, and, learning with, not learning about, and learning from them, not just learning about them.
I'm really excited to dig into these resources and go on a little journey myself. There are a lot of initiatives in higher ed, and I want to speak delicately about this because I am concerned about saying the wrong thing. But, there are a lot of initiatives in higher ed. And I had a colleague, actually, I had a conversation about this because I have some educational experience in Indigenous history. That does not make me by any means any sort of expert. But compared to a colleague that doesn't have any, I guess, education or have many conversations of this nature with people. So I had a colleague say that they understand that there are these initiatives in higher ed, but he doesn't know what it means. What is the how? We speak very broadly of decolonization and indigenization in our classrooms, in our content, in our conversations. But what does that look like in boots on the ground? How can we, as people who may be uneducated in this specific area, act like experts? And I use that in quotations because we're not, but in a classroom, you are naturally seen as an expert,
Mhm.
and how to incorporate that and still do our part. So there are a lot of missing pieces still in higher ed to really support educators.
For me, I think I've written about it on LinkedIn. let's put this in my experience specifically. One of the first steps for me, I mentioned that podcast from the Office of the Provincial Health Officer. One of the other metaphors that they use was a net, the net of settler colonialism. And they go into like this beautiful metaphor. They've got an image of a public art installation from Vancouver that was there a few years ago. And this net of settler colonialism that catches all of society, everything about our society in it. And if you think about the image of how a net is, you've got all of these strands of rope and these knots where they're tied together that just hangs through and across, and it catches everything. And yes, occasionally something can get through, but like it really does catch everything. And so one of the first steps is to be able to see that net of settler colonialism. What are those individual colonial strands? And then they talk about in their work having I think they called it a knot log or something like that, of like, what are those colonial knots? That now that you can recognize it and you can see it, it's within your sphere of influence. And you don't want to just like cut the net down, because that does a lot of damage. Everything falls. But how do you start to undo that net? First, you got to recognize it. So if you're not there yet, that's okay. Your next step is to continue learning about colonialism within Canada and what that means, and truth and reconciliation, and really learning the impacts on Indigenous peoples. I gave some examples of my family's history. What was happening with settlers at the time? What were those differences which were structurally put in place by government, by church administrators, if we think the Indian residential school system that was still supported by the federal government? How have those structures treated European settlers different from the First Nations whose territory you may be on? Here within BC, one example I can give of that difference is the 1870 Colonial Land Ordinance granted up to 320 acres of land to European settler males over 18 years old. And they could purchase as much more from the Crown as they would like. First Nations at the time were completely excluded from that, were not compensated for the land that was taken from them to grant this to settlers. So they could not access these land grants, essentially. And here within BC, specifically the territory where I'm on, there is no treaty. So there was no treaty signed between the First Nations and the Crown. So you think about those differences in how the settler laws treated settlers, how Canadian laws have treated the settler society in those early days, right up until now. Settler colonialism is ongoing. Now, how much does land ownership give access to wealth and generational wealth? So if European settler males could get access to 320 acres of land granted from the Crown, how does that access generational wealth impact the First Nations who are specifically excluded from that, could not make those claims, could not purchase land from the Crown? That's an example of seeing how the net of settler colonialism has set up those differences and has really privileged settlers. And so step one is learning to see that net. And if you're still in that, continue looking at it and continue looking at those discrepancies, not just looking at the trauma. Like, we don't want this to turn into just like Indigenous people have been traumatized. And then also looking for like, what is the brilliance that Indigenous peoples bring? What lessons do they already have? Getting into the practicality, the nitty gritties of it. Like, seriously, this book,
Okay,
Joe
like
Corona,
yeah.
a number of the chapters, she had a blog that she wrote beforehand. So a number of the chapters also have blog posts in her blog that you can find online. There's a great resource. Again, it was developed for K through 12 on reviewing content and curriculum. It's a checklist, which we know is, kind of colonial. But how do you ensure authentic Indigenous representation within your classroom? Are you using authentic Indigenous resources? How do you know it's authentic? What assessment criteria do you have around that? The First Nations Education Steering Committee has developed an amazing tool to bring this in. to ensure, like, whatever course we're teaching, are we considering Indigenous perspectives on this topic area? And so that's one practical aspect that folks can like work with is this checklist that the First Nations Education Steering Committee has. I don't know if that was their purpose when they built it, that like some random corporate L&D person is going to stumble across it and go like, "Hey, like why aren't we using something like this? Like what can we learn from this which has already been developed?" which First Nations people in BC have contributed into. I agree. It's the conversation. There's a lot of like big theory and then it's like, but what does this mean in specifics? And it's like, only you can answer that. And it takes
Yes,
a lot of deeper learning. It's not a quick
that's what it
shortcut
is.
answer.
That's what I was thinking after I asked that question or posed that scenario, and then we continued to talk, it dawned on me that at the end of the day, it's not a thing that educators add to our classroom. It's not a checklist. It is a genuine interest in dismantling of self and a
Hmm.
journey that one needs to go on in order to, I don't know how to say it, but it would be a learning journey of self. It's
A lot
not
of
a
that.
thing that you can just like an activity in your classroom, and I think that a lot of us educators kind of cling on to an activity or a thing per se, because a learning of self is a little sounds a little overwhelming or, I'm like, "I don't have time for that." But really that's it it is some portion of that that needs to be done to truly decolonize our classrooms because we need to understand where it stems from, how we
Mhm.
play a part. And it's not just an easy fix at all. And I think who doesn't love an easy fix?
Right? I
Like, come
know,
on,
we all want that quick, like, "Give me the checklist that
right?
I can show you that this course has been decolonized," and it doesn't work like that
Yeah.
at all. It doesn't work like that, from what I have learned and in my experience, and, like I said, it's building some trust and building some relationships, and it is that ongoing. I've
Mm,
just scratched the surface. One of the areas I want to grow into more and do more in my own journey is, I mentioned I'm on the unceded territories of the Quetzin people. So, what are those ways of knowing and being that I can learn from the Quetzin people that is specific to this land and these lands that might impact how I show up in learning and development and work and that I can honor and what is appropriate for me to use out of that and to learn from them. So that's one of the other pieces. Like I want to respect where I'm not entitled to information because I'm not an Indigenous person. And I think that's the other piece of it as colonial educators. We're like, everybody's entitled to this information. And it's like, well, no.
it's not ours.
Like
Yeah.
there is absolutely spaces for knowledge that making sure I'm showing up in a good way, in a relational way, that it's not just about me coming in and taking that information. And that's sort of where I think my next steps in this journey is looking at how I can improve my relationships with the nations whose land I'm on. What's my relationship with the Quetzin peoples and their priorities and ways of knowing and being, and how do I show up for them?
I love this. Okay. So I'm taking it all in. As we start to wind down the conversation, Jillian, what's coming up for you in terms of maybe a piece of advice or a new educator, whether it be in corporate or in academia?
I have kind of a lengthy one, if that's okay.
I got nothing but time. Let's do
Because
it. I'm
I
excited. I
mentioned
don't want this
earlier that it's
conversation to
like
end.
I have a list of questions that I sort of ask
Oh,
myself
you're
in
going to
this
share
work
those?
that I
Okay,
can totally
sweet.
share those as
Okay.
part of my advice to it. So I'm gonna start off with it being like, there's no shortcut to this. That's my advice. There's no shortcut. It is, we've already mentioned it. It's the mix of like self-reflection, self-directed learning, relationship work with Indigenous peoples, being able to work on specific projects and application. Like for me, it started coming together on a project and I started getting into application where it's like, oh, suddenly all these pieces fell into place. And showing up in those relationships in a good way and not in an extractive way. One of the other pieces of advice I would have is don't rely on your Indigenous colleagues for the answers. That's why I say there's no shortcut. So before I go to my Indigenous colleagues for answers, because that's putting extra burden on them off the side of their
Right.
desk, to ask
Right.
them to speak for all Indigenous peoples on what decolonization means, let's not do that to them. I've got a list of, I don't know, maybe 10 questions. Am I entitled to this information? And if yes, why do I feel entitled to this information if I'm looking to learn more about something? Can I find the answer on my own through either research, observation, um, and like I don't mean research in the academic sense. I do mean it truly in the like Google sense. Um,
Good old
do I
fashioned
have
Google.
do I have the skills to actually assess whether those resources I'm finding through my research are authentic Indigenous perspectives? Do I have the skills to distinguish between if it's the perspective of a single Indigenous person or someone who has the authority to speak on behalf of a community and peoples? Because that gets different when we talk about like collective views and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. If I'm thinking the Quw'utsun ways of knowing and being, who has the authority to speak on that? Or is it one person? What's my intention in asking? If I'm going to go and ask my Indigenous colleague about this, what is my intention? Um, and what's my relationship with that person like? If it's a colleague at work, is there any sort of real or implied power dynamics that I should be considerate of? And how do I ensure that I'm reciprocal in that relationship and that it doesn't feel extractive to that Indigenous person, or that it doesn't feel like if I'm implied hierarchy, I'm in a very hierarchical organization, that it's implied that like you must answer me because I am a higher pay band than you in a more senior position to you. So how do I consider those power dynamics before I go and hold that? How can I ask permission to ask the questions? Can I seek consent? If I'm going to go and ask my colleague, can I seek consent? And how will I respond if they say no? It is not
Interesting.
truly consent if they don't have the ability to safely say no. So, how will I manage any sort of emotional reaction to their answer, yes or no? And also, how will I manage my emotional reaction to what I learned that doesn't place a burden on them? I mentioned earlier in the conversation, like my complicated white people feelings.
Yes.
Yeah, I've had an emotional journey. And my
Yeah.
Indigenous colleagues who have helped my learning along this journey, it is not their responsibility to help me process them. Now, some of
Right.
them I am close enough friends with that like we've had some spaces where there is space for me to feel things. And I adore her for that. Like we are quite close that way. But that should not be an expectation.
Right.
My feelings and my emotional reaction to what I learn about colonialism is mine to process. And so I can't put that extra work and burden onto Indigenous peoples. All of that comes down to that if I'm going to seek out that information and learn more, how do I show up in a way that builds trust and relationship and reciprocity? So before I even go to ask questions, do I have a relationship with the person in the first place? Am I literally just messaging them to ask a question to extract some information? In which case, no, let me find another way to do it. Or do I already have an established relationship with this Indigenous colleague and I can go in and say like, hey, I've been trying to learn more about this and I'm not finding any good resources online for it. Is this something you're open to talking with me about it? If they say yes or no, respect their decision. If they say yes, great. I can, have that conversation, thank them for their time. So that's just sort of one example. So yeah, my advice would be build relationships, build trust. There's no shortcut. Take the initiative to do some self-directed learning and just lean in when it gets complicated and messy and uncomfortable feeling. Just lean in and sit with that and process those
Wow.
feelings.
This is beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing those questions.
I have to give credit to, I took a course through the Victoria Native Friendship Center a few years ago now, a year ago now, the community learning program, which I believe has evolved and has undergone some shifts, but they had a section in there, the whole like seeking consent before asking questions. I have to give them credit for the first time I'd considered that. And it was the same way you had the reaction when I brought it up, is like, how will I respond if they say no?
Right? Yes.
Like,
And to think about that ahead of time and that level of respect, um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's become one of the like foundational questions I ask myself, thanks to that course that I took with the Victoria Native Friendship
But
Center.
what an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, for where you're at now, and everything that you are doing to change the system.
Yeah.
I have so much respect for that. And with your studies and everything next as well. Good luck. This has been
Thank
so
you.
invigorating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining, Julia, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Educator Experience. We hope you're walking away feeling connected, inspired, and just a little bit more supported on your journey. Ready to go a little bit deeper? Join the Educator Experiences community and check out our courses and workshops specifically designed to support new educators as they navigate the ups, downs, and everything in between. You'll find it all at educatorexperiences.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Together, we're building a vibrant community rooted in support and connection. See y'all next Monday.